One of the many reasons I believe that we are Catholic is because even people who are not Catholic, even people who are not Christian, even people who say they don't even believe in God, recognize that there is something absolutely special about the Christian faith. Many people, even though they themselves are not Catholic, and many of them actually hostile to the Catholic faith or to Christianity, are intrigued by the person and the teaching of Jesus Christ. Even people who despise the Catholic faith have to admit that our society has been impregnated with true Christian values, the absolute respect for the human person, the great moral, if you want to say, legacy of the Catholic Church is admired by many people. Take, for example, Fidel Castro, no friend of the Catholic faith. Although he is, and was, because he, as you know, passed on, was ideologically opposed to Christianity, he came to Cuba to instill La Revolución, the socialist revolution, which of course, as in every place socialism has been brought, has been an absolute failure. His people were left in misery and poverty. And although on the one hand he had to preach against Christianity, he secretly invited the nuns of Mother Teresa to come to his island to minister to his people. Why? Because on the one hand he realized that these nuns were consumed with a love for Jesus Christ, that they would even offer and give their own lives to help the poorest of the poor, something that certainly is not a byproduct of communism or socialism. Or take, for example, Mahatma Gandhi. Although he himself was a practicing Hindu, he admitted that he was fascinated by the teachings and the person of Jesus Christ, especially the words of the gospel, most especially the Sermon on the Mount. There is even a possibility that Mahatma Gandhi would have eventually become Christian. But unfortunately, as happens in so many cases, he says, the reason I am not a Christian is because of Christians. He tried to get into a church, a Christian church one time, and he was refused admittance because he was not a member of the higher caste system, the caste system in India. So you see, we here admit everyone, no matter what caste system you're from. Very nice. But unfortunately, Mahatma Gandhi encountered Christians who were not really Christian. And he was turned off by these Christians, and therefore he was turned off from Jesus. Or take, for example, the pagans of ancient Rome. Tertullian, the ancient theologian and Christian writer, wrote that when the pagans looked at the Christians, although they persecuted and despised the Christians, they had to admit at least, look at how the Christians love one another. However, we pagans hate one another. Look at how the Christians are ready to die for one another, when we pagans are only ready to kill one another. So although people may actually even despise Christianity, they have to admit there's absolutely something special about the Christian faith. And no matter who you are, you have to admit that nothing more than Catholicism or the Christian faith, no other worldview, no other way of seeing the world, no other organization has given to the world so many saints, done more for the poor and the oppressed, has set up more hospitals, has produced more works, amazing works of art and architecture, beautiful musical scores. It's undeniable. The Christian faith has produced marvelous works, more than any other group in the history of mankind. We Catholics should be proud of what we have done. Don't listen to, the nicest way of putting it, the baloney you hear about the sins of the church. Yes, certain Christians have not done good things, but if you look at the overall balance, you see the amazing beauty and goodness and truth of the Catholic faith. And despite all of the beautiful and positive things that Jesus and his teachings and the church have brought to the world, there is still hatred and opposition to the Catholic faith. Why? And this is the subject of my homily. And I think sometimes we can give a very superficial answer. Well, people don't like a specific teaching of the church. That's not the real reason why people disagree with the Catholic faith or reject it. Jesus Christ came, and he was very clear about why he came. He did not come to bring any discord. He came to bring union, to reconcile us to God the Father and to each other. Jesus even went so far as to give his life, to lay down his life, so that we could be reconciled to God. Countless people have been fascinated by the example of what Jesus did on the cross. Or they become really admirers of the great saints like St. Maximilian Kolbe, who, following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, laid down his life for a man that he barely knew. But he knew this was what it means to be a Christian. Countless people have been amazed at the sacrificial love and the charity of Christians throughout history. Why then division? Why then rejection of the gospel? Well, obviously we can give an initial answer, and I think in a sense it's a little superficial. But some people say, well, people either stand against or reject Jesus and his gospel because they may have a different worldview. But that in and of itself is not the real reason. Sometimes people will not outright say, I reject Jesus. No one would actually say that. I hate Jesus, or I think Jesus is a horrible person. No one would ever say that. They use more refined answers like, well, Father, I'm more spiritual than religious. Or, one of my favorites, I follow Christ, but not religion. These are just ways of excusing themselves from actually following Jesus Christ. What, therefore, is the real reason why people reject the gospel, or why people in their families encounter division? And I think this is the reason we need to consider today. Ultimately, the division that occurs in society, or the fact that some people are for or against the church, boils down to a very simple fact. It's not the message itself. The message itself is a beautiful and powerful message. What, therefore, is the cause of division? It's not the message, but rather the way people receive it. And I'll explain. Many people can be openly hostile and reject the teachings of the church and Jesus. Some people can wholeheartedly accept them. But in between these two extremes, we have a very half-hearted or very superficial Christianity. But in essence, if someone does not full-heartedly, completely accept the Christian faith, then they have, in essence, rejected it. And this is what Christ is saying. The reason that sometimes the faith will bring discord and division in families is because some of the family members have not fully accepted the gospel. Anyone who places anything before Jesus Christ, even their own family, Jesus tells us, you have not understood the gospel. You have not accepted the gospel. And this is precisely what Jesus Christ is saying in today's gospel. Even if you place family, son, daughter, mother, father before me, you eventually will not be able to follow me. In other words, if we put something above Jesus in our lives, no matter what it may be, even something very good and noble, we are undermining the very possibility of being able to follow Jesus Christ. It's like clipping our wings and then trying to fly. If we put anything as more important in our life above Jesus, then we will eventually leave Jesus and not follow him. And this is extremely important because it's the way we accept the gospel. This is what Christ is telling us. Unless you wholeheartedly accept me and my gospel, you will eventually end up living a life of division. I think Pope Francis has a beautiful saying to this regard when he says, there is no such thing as a part-time Christian. We're not simply Christians for 1 hour during the week. We must be fully Christian at every single moment in our lives. What, therefore, causes us to fall away from Jesus? Well, Jesus tells us in today's gospel. Jesus, throughout the gospel, reminds us of what he calls improper or disordered attachments. And he does so not because Jesus is jealous of other things. He is the creator. He's not jealous. Jesus warns us against improper or disordered attachments, which can even include our family. he does so for our own good. One of my favorite stories in the gospel is the story of the rich young man who comes up to Jesus. And this young man was very devout. He was a devout Jew. He practiced his faith. He was very observant of the commandments. He was a God-fearing man. You would have thought this is a perfect disciple for Jesus. But he had a disordered attachment to his possessions. And Jesus knew this. He said, "You have done many things for me, but there is still one more thing I ask of you. If you want to be my disciple, go sell everything you have, give the money to the poor, and follow me." And he could not. Why? Because in his life, there was something more important than God. Brothers and sisters, all of us profess a faith in Jesus Christ. But I think we need to ask ourselves, with all honesty, what am I willing to put aside for Jesus and the gospel? Is there anything in my life that I am not willing to put aside for the sake of the gospel? And I think this will show us where my heart is. Where is my treasure, Jesus says. My treasure is where my heart is. And if Jesus Christ and his gospel is not the treasure and the foundation of my life, then I will eventually leave him. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with our struggles with sin. It doesn't mean that if you are a follower of Jesus Christ and he is the most important person in your life that you will not have any sins. No. All of us struggle with sin. The problem comes in, or the disordered attachment comes in, when we say, well, I refuse to give something up in order to follow Jesus. Someone living an immoral lifestyle, they refuse to give it up in order to follow Jesus. And Jesus says, there is one thing I ask you to do. Give up this lifestyle. Give up this way of thinking. Give up this way of being. And you say, no, I cannot. And what happens? Like the rich young man, we leave Jesus. You see, Jesus is very clear. If you want to be my follower, if you want to be worthy of me, you have to be willing to be giving up anything that I ask you to give up. And certainly I think we think of this in a very negative way. Oh gosh, Jesus is asking us to give up things that are good. Quite the contrary. Jesus is actually purifying the good things in our life and making us love them more. But unfortunately, when it comes to disordered attachments, even in our own family, we can have a disordered attachment or a disordered affection. And what does that mean? It means that for the sake of family peace, we are willing to compromise the gospel. When I was in Poland, something that really struck me as interesting. The Polish are very devout people, very Catholic. I loved Poland, as you know. But there was something that some people said that really bugged me. They would say, Father, how are you doing? How's your health? I said, I'm very healthy. I'm doing well. Oh, that's good. That's the most important thing. No, it's not. Or I've heard people in the United States say the most important thing in life is family. No. Family is very important. Health is very important. But it is not the most important thing. Because if we say that family or health is the most important thing in my life, what are we really saying? We are admitting that there is something more important than Jesus Christ and his gospel. And this is an improper attachment. This is exactly, precisely what Christ wants to warn us against. And what happens if I'm overly attached to a member of my family and they want to do something that's wrong, or they want me to affirm them in something that's wrong, and I am so attached to them that I don't want to do anything to offend them, what happens? I betray Christ. I give in. Now, obviously, this is wrong on two levels. First of all, because I betray Jesus. But secondly, by affirming someone in a sinful action, I'm not doing them any good. Quite the contrary. I'm actually inflicting an injury upon them. And this is why Jesus says, if you truly want to be my apostle, my disciple, then you must put me in the first place. And brothers and sisters, many times an improper attachment, disordered attachment, to a family member can actually be a hindrance to our salvation. This even happens on a purely human level. All of you know these examples, which I'm about to give. I'll never forget, even on a purely human level, you can see how a disordered attachment to a family member is something that destroys our way of thinking and our reasoning. I had a mother call me up one day and say, "Father, I want to complain because the director of the school punished my son for something he did not do." Well, as you know, I have my spies. So I asked several people who were there who saw what happened. All 4 of them said, "Yes, this boy did what the director said he did, and he should be punished." So I called the mother back and I said, "Mom, I want you to know that I've asked 4 different people, and they all saw your son do what you say he didn't do." And she replied, "Well, they're all wrong." Let me tell you, when Mama Bear comes out, be careful. Mama Bear sometimes doesn't think rationally because she so loves her children. She's attached to her children. There's nothing wrong with loving your children. But sometimes our attachments can cause us not to see the truth of the matter. And this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus does not encourage us to hate our families. No, he encourages us to love them. But in order to truly love my family to the highest possible degree, I must love them in God, in Jesus Christ. And this is what the gospel message is about. The gospel message involves a choice. I must make a choice. In essence, what the gospel is about is making Jesus Christ the Lord of my life. It is making Jesus Christ the supreme value in my life. Jesus doesn't claim to be simply an option in life. Jesus says, "I am the way, the life, and the truth." Not one way. I am the way to the Father. He says, "The Father and I are one." These are not ambivalent claims. Jesus Christ is claiming to be God himself. That's a pretty bold claim. And unless I consciously choose to believe Jesus, sooner or later, I will end up leaving him. I have to consciously choose to believe exactly what Jesus says about himself. Because if I don't, I'm actually undermining the possibility of following him. Again, it's like a bird without wings. Once he clips his wings, the bird can't fly. Once I allow something to be more important in my life than Jesus, I cannot be his disciple. People that always intrigue and amaze me are converts and reverts to the faith. As I said last weekend, they're the real Catholics. Of course, I'm a credo Catholic. I consider myself to be a real Catholic. But there is something special about converts and reverts. Usually in their lives, they have to leave something behind. They have to make a radical decision. And many times this means they have to leave behind family and friends in order to follow Jesus. But they do it because they know that Jesus should be always the most important person in their lives. And I met a lawyer who was an atheist and then became a very devout Catholic. And I asked him, as a priest, I'm very simple. I don't understand certain things. And one thing I cannot wrap my head around is how someone can claim to be Catholic and yet reject the teachings of the church. How can you claim to be Catholic and yet really not be Catholic? Because you reject the teachings of the church, you're not a Catholic. You reject teachings of the church. He said, "Father, it's very easy. In the life of every person, there has to be one supreme value. And what happens if Jesus is not the supreme value in your life, something else will become more important. And sooner or later, you will end up leaving Jesus because the supreme value will trump Jesus Christ." And it's true. Unless Jesus is the supreme value, the most important person in my life, unless he is the Lord of my life, then sooner or later, I will not be able to follow Jesus. And this is what happens when Christians, they say they're followers of Jesus Christ, they say they're Christians, and yet what happens when they put something above God, then really what they're doing is undermining the very possibility of being a disciple. And all this reminds us, and this is the truth of the gospel as well, that true and authentic love requires a proper hierarchy. We need to love something more than others. For example, maybe someone loves their car and their job and their sports team. But when the wife says, "We're not going to watch sports tonight, we're going out for dinner," you have to make a choice. Reminds me of the story of a man. And before I tell you, it's a joke, so just because I told people in the earlier masses they didn't get it until the very end, so Father's telling a joke, so I'm giving you a warning. This is a joke. So a gentleman got tickets to the Super Bowl, and he was in the nosebleed section, so he was way up there, and he had a pair of binoculars. He was looking down on the very front row on the 50-yard line. He saw there was a gentleman. Next to this gentleman, there was an empty seat. He thought, well, I'll wait, and if no one comes to that seat, maybe I'll go ask the gentleman if I can sit there. So about 5 minutes before the game began, the Super Bowl, he goes down. No one's sitting there. He says, "Sir, is this seat empty?" He says, "Sure, go ahead, sit there." And he says, "Well, why is it empty?" And the guy said, "Oh, well, my wife and I used to come to all the games, and, I wanted to bring her to the Super Bowl, but, she died, and I could not find anyone to come and be with me at the Super Bowl." And the guy thought, "This is crazy. How could he not? And this is the Super Bowl." He says, "Don't you have children?" "Yes, I have 4 sons." "And not one of them could come?" "No, not one of them could come." "Well, do you have friends?" "I have a lot of friends." "And not one of your friends could come?" "No." "Well, you have business associates?" "Yeah." "Not one of them?" "No, not one of them could come." And the guy says, "With all these people you know, why didn't they come?" And the guy said, "Well, because they're at my wife's funeral." That guy didn't have a proper hierarchy in his life, did he? No. We laugh, but how many times are we just like that gentleman, choosing things that really are not as important over God? Brothers and sisters, the gospel today reminds us true and authentic love for our families must necessarily mean that God is the greatest love in our life. When Jesus was asked by someone, "What is the greatest of all the commandments?" what does he say? "To love the Lord your God first with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then you can love your neighbor." And who's your neighbor? Your family, your children. Everyone is your neighbor. So if I want to really love my family to the greatest possible degree, if I want to be the best authentic person in this world, then God says, first you must love me with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then you will be able to love your family in a proper and ordered way. You won't have a disordered affection or be taken in by perhaps some affection you have for someone. Because if God is always in the first place, then you will truly love everyone as you should. And I will close with a little story from the seminary that I think illustrates perfectly today's gospel. When I was a seminarian, I had a spiritual director, and you would go in every 2 or 3 weeks to talk to this priest. And the thing that sort of struck me first when I went into his office was that he had this huge bookshelf with all these books on it. Most of the books had little colored dots on the book. So finally I got enough courage up and I asked him, what do the different colored dots mean? Now in our seminary, we were missionaries, so we could be sent away like that. It's not like the diocese where they give you at least a month's warning. As a missionary, they can tell you 2 days before, they can tell you a day before, they can tell you 5 hours or even 1 hour before you're supposed to leave. So this priest said, well, the dots are coded, so anything with a blue dot is a book that if I have a day to pack, I have to take these books as well. How about the green dots? Well, the green dots are if I only have 5 hours to pack, I know I have to take these books and leave the blue books behind. Oh. And how about the yellow dots? The yellow dots are if I only have 1 hour to pack, so I leave the blue and the green dots behind, but these books are the ones I have to take. And then I noticed 2 books with a red dot. Or maybe there were 3. And I said, and these dots? He said, these dots are the books I would take if I only had 5 minutes to pack. Because they were the most important thing in his life, as far as books go. So we should ask ourselves, in our lives we have many values, many loves, many attachments, but only one can have the red dot. What has the red dot in my life?